My guest at this time is Andrew C. McCarthy, former Chief Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. He's also the author of Ball of Collusion, The Plot to Rig an Election and Destroy a Presidency. In addition, he's a Fox News contributor and a contributing editor and columnist at National Review. He joins us today to offer a quick reaction to the impeachment report from the House Intelligence Committee and to separate fiction from fact when it comes to Ukraine's role in the 2016 campaign. And Andy, it's always good to have you with us.
Greg, thanks so much for having me. Great to be here.
Well, we'll get to Ukraine in just a moment, but today is the day that Adam Schiff and the Intelligence Committee released their impeachment report. You've had the chance to go through it. The media summaries are essentially what the Democrats have been saying for a number of months now, and that's that President Trump abused the power of his office for personal political gain in demanding investigations, or at least an announced investigation, into the Bidens and CrowdStrike. So, Andy, you've had a chance to look at this report. What stands out to you, and do you think it changes where we are in this right now at all?
I really think it ends the game in this sense, Greg. I'm really taken aback, and I believe me, I didn't come at this with high expectations for even the feint of bipartisanship, but I'm really taken aback at how nakedly, unapologetically politicized the report is. And I'm not, I don't want to suggest that I thought that Adam Schiff was anything other than a fierce partisan infighter. But I also thought, he's a smart enough, sophisticated enough guy to understand that you can't seriously hope to remove the president from power without attracting the votes of Republicans and independents, without attracting support in the public from Republicans and independents. And that, it seems to me, would have required, at the very least, laying out, as he made his points, the opposition case, even if it was just for the purpose of refuting it. At least say, there's two ways of looking at this, or three ways of looking at this. Here is our best interpretation. Here's why we think the other ways of looking at it are not persuasive. There's no attempt at that at all. This is simply the same partisan narrative that you got from Chairman Schiff in the beginning and end of each of the different hearings that he had last week, which in and of themselves were very partisan hearings in the sense that they didn't give the president or the Republicans much of an opportunity either to present their alternative version of events or, in the president's case, even to challenge some of the witnesses against him. So I'm just really surprised at how unapologetically partisan this is, only because, I having written a book about impeachment and studied it a lot, one of the things that I was really struck by is that it makes no sense to commence an impeachment unless you think you really have a good chance of removing the president. There's got to be some plausible possibility of that, because if you care about governance, to try to impeach a president or to commence impeachment when you don't have a real chance of removing the president is to encourage the excesses of the executive branch, because a president who's been accused and acquitted, there's a perverse incentive that gets created that, you're basically going to take one shot, and if you don't get the president, all bets are off. So you don't really want to go this route unless there's a realistic chance of removal. And that's the reason why historically impeachment has been so rare, even though it's not at all rare that the presidency and the House of Representatives are controlled by different parties. People realize that it doesn't make any sense, and it's also a waste of time. It's very divisive in the society. It's dysfunctional as far as the government is concerned to impeach unless there's a real chance for removal. And it seems to me that they've hauled off and done this for, as much as I could detect, nothing more than 2020 campaign purposes, and I wonder if it's going to be effective even for that.
We're talking with Andy McCarthy. And Andy, you've told us before why you believe even the facts, as pretty much everyone agrees to them, and even some of what the Democrats allege, but is contested, doesn't rise to impeachment based on what the founders intended impeachment to be used for. I can imagine some folks listening to what you just said about the majority not even acknowledging the minority argument or arguing that it's not persuasive. They might say, well, they didn't do that, but what about the facts as they present them? Is that rising to the level of impeachment? You don't believe that. Why?
Well, I think that to have an impeachable offense in the sense of an offense that has a chance of persuading 2/3 of the Senate to remove the president, you have to have conduct that is objectively egregious and outrageous. And I think what happened here, we seem to have lost our capacity to distinguish things that are wrong from things that are so outrageously wrong that the person who does them should be removed from power. What happened here, I'm perfectly willing to concede. I actually think the president should concede this since he spent 3 years complaining about Obama in this vein. I'm perfectly willing to concede that it is wrong for the president to exploit his control over Article 2 powers in order to achieve nothing other than personal political advantage. And therefore, to the extent that the president is caught here exploiting his foreign affairs powers in part to provoke an investigation of his political rival, someone who could very well be the 2020 Democratic nominee, and to do it, it appears, for not much more than to have an announcement from the Ukrainians that they were conducting an investigation. He wasn't even in the end pushing for an actual investigation. It seems like they just wanted an announcement that there'd be an investigation. I think that's wrong. On the other hand, you have to look at the wages of it. First of all, it's not as clearly wrong as the Democrats want to make it out. And this, I think the big tell on this is what Adam Schiff said in the first hearing that was public when the director of national intelligence testified and Schiff did that cockamamie parody version of the Trump-Zelensky call, where he has Trump saying to Zelensky in the caricature, I want you to make up dirt on my political opponent, lots of it. Trump didn't ask Zelensky to make up dirt on Joe Biden. He asked him to investigate something that appears to be an exemplar of self-dealing, if not corruption, and that cries out to be investigated. And I've always thought that that was a telling error on Schiff's part, because it conveys that he, as a former federal prosecutor and someone who's been a politician for a long time and is a fairly clever fellow, he knows that that's the kind of evidence, the kind that he laid out in the parody, that's the kind of evidence you would need to be in the ballpark of impeachment, where you're asking the other country to make up something out of whole cloth. That's not what Trump did here. And there are provisions of law that call for him to assure Ukrainian anti-corruption efforts. I know that people counter that he wasn't trying to assure anti-corruption. He was, pretextually trying to get an investigation of Biden. But it's still a fact that what he was asking for was a corruption investigation. And it's not the only thing he was asking for. He was asking for assistance in the Justice Department's investigation of Ukraine's role in the 2020 election. And while it's true that he specifically cited a discredited conspiracy theory that has Ukraine involved in the actual hacking of the Democratic email accounts, the fact of the matter is Ukraine was involved in meddling in the 2016 election. Even a Ukrainian court has found that is true. And I think one of the real failings of Schiff's report is he doesn't acknowledge that at all. He simply says that what Trump wanted solely and only, other than the investigation of Biden, was an investigation into this discredited theory, which was being done only to propagate the discredited idea that Ukraine, not Russia, meddled in the 2016 election. And that's not the only thing Trump was asking for. He was asking for an investigation into what Ukraine's role was in the 2016 election. And that completely is consistent with the fact that the Justice Department is conducting a legitimate investigation into the origins of the Trump-Russia investigation. I know the Democrats don't like that investigation, just like I didn't like the Mueller investigation. I know they think it's completely political and part of the Trump 2016 campaign or 2020 campaign. But the fact of the matter is it's a legitimate Justice Department investigation, and he's allowed to ask a foreign power for help in it. And then, Greg, when you get finally to the other end of the equation, there was no harm here. Ukraine got their defense aid. The Democrats don't want to talk much about the defense aid because the aid that, for all their talk about, how much we need to help our strategic partner Ukraine defend itself from the predations of Russia, the fact of the matter is Trump has been providing Ukraine with better military assistance than Ukraine got from Obama. And in this instance, while Trump delayed the aid, the Ukrainians got it. And there's no indication whatsoever that Ukraine was damaged in any way by the delay. And Zelensky himself says that he didn't feel like he was being pressured by the president. So when you get to the end of this whole thing, it's like, as we said, I think the last time we discussed this, I call this the Seinfeld of impeachments. Nothing happened when you get to the end of this thing. So I just don't see this as an impeachable offense.
Andy, just following up on the Ukraine situation, and you explain what is bogus, CrowdStrike, it appears certainly, and then there are other things that have a lot more basis, and folks like Politico, and I believe the New York Times actually reported on the fact that statements and other steps were made to support Hillary Clinton in 2016. But the thing that seems to be equated here is that any suggestion of any Ukrainian support or preference for one candidate or the other somehow is an argument that Russia didn't interfere in 2016. Why is there this perception out there that it can only be one way or the other?
Because there is this discredited theory, Greg, that somehow the Ukrainians were the ones who pulled off the actual hacking of the DNC accounts, and that the DNC server somehow has been whisked away and is being hidden in Ukraine in order to conceal Ukraine's culpability for that act. And nobody who's been following this closely believes that. It's unfortunate that the president is vulnerable or susceptible to these conspiracy theories out of what I think is his somewhat irrational desire to have some alternative explanation other than Russia being the ones who carried out the operations against the Democratic email accounts, because I guess, he takes to heart the idea that this questions the legitimacy of his election. I think that's foolish on his part. He was not culpable at all in Russia's operations, and I don't think they made a bit of difference in the 2016 election. The Democrats lost the 2016 election because they nominated a terrible candidate who didn't campaign correctly toward the end of the campaign, like going to the places where she needed to nail down traditional Democratic strongholds. And that's the explanation for why they lost the election. But that theory of Ukrainian interference in the American election is not the only theory of Ukrainian interference. And there's a lot of evidence that Ukraine not only promoted Hillary Clinton's candidacy at the expense of Trump's, but a Ukrainian court has found that two Ukrainian officials, at least the head of the anti-corruption police and a parliamentarian, actually meddled in the election to the degree of leaking into the media information that was harmful to Paul Manafort, and thus resulted in his being bounced out of the campaign, which was greatly to the detriment of the Trump campaign at the time, and was used as part of the foundation for the story that Trump was in the pocket of Russia, because Manafort was deemed to have been an agent of a pro-Russian Ukrainian faction. So this is not just me saying that the Ukrainians meddled in the 2016 election. As you point out, there's been a lot of reporting about it, and as I again would stress, even a Ukrainian court has found this to be the case.
It's amazing what each side latches onto in these situations, and so even a statement here and there has to be dismissed because it doesn't fit the narrative. But Andy, I have a feeling we're going to be talking some more this month as the Judiciary Committee now takes up the mantle of the impeachment report, and I think if the Democrats have the schedule they want, we're going to have a floor vote by the time we all celebrate Christmas. So stay tuned.
Sure sounds like, Greg.
Andy McCarthy, former Chief Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, also the author of Ball of Collusion, The Plot to Rig an Election and Destroy a Presidency. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.